Nobody inside the paddock expected it to start like this. Not with a crash, not with a confrontation, but with a braking zone that simply didn't make sense. At first glance, it looked ordinary. The same corner, the same entry speed, the same reference point every rider had trusted for years, yet one rider kept arriving later, slowing faster, and somehow keeping the bike under control. Engineers stared at the data in silence. Riders replayed it in their minds. And slowly, an unsettling realization began to spread. What Toprak was doing on the brakes didn't just look aggressive. It didn't just look brave. It looked impossible. Because according to everything Ducati science believed, it shouldn't have worked at all. And that's when shock turned into doubt. The braking zone that raised alarms. It began with a single lap, then another, and then a pattern. Toprak was braking later than the reference points everyone else respected, but the real surprise wasn't the distance. It was the way the bike behaved once the brakes were applied. No violent front-end movement. No chaotic load spikes. No visible struggle to slow the bike. From the outside, it looked smooth, almost casual. From the data, it was anything but. Deceleration curves appeared steeper than expected. Front-load graphs showed behavior that didn't align with Ducati's models. Brake pressure rose differently, not explosively, but with a strange calmness that shouldn't have survived the forces involved. Engineers quietly ran the numbers again. And again. Some assumed a sensor issue, others blamed track conditions, a few suggested tire variance. But the explanation never fully landed. Because no matter how many times the data was checked, the results stayed the same. Toprak was stopping the bike faster, without paying the price Ducati science said was unavoidable. And once that truth settled in, the questions became far more dangerous. A rider shaped outside the prototype world. Toprak's instincts weren't built inside the modern MotoGP pipeline. They were forged somewhere harsher, somewhere less forgiving. World SBK rewards feel, it punishes hesitation, and it teaches riders to trust the front tire long after logic says they shouldn't. Production-based bikes move more, communicate more, and they demand constant negotiation between grip and disaster. Those years rewired Toprak's understanding of braking. Where others relied on references and electronic reassurance, he learned to read microsignals, tire deformation, subtle feedback through the bars, the exact moment grip transitions from secure to fragile. When he arrived in a world ruled by prototypes, aero load, and predictive electronics, many assumed those instincts would need to be erased. Instead, they became his advantage. Engineers initially believed this style wouldn't survive MotoGP forces. Too much speed, too much downforce, too much weight transfer. But now the evidence suggested something far more uncomfortable. The rider hadn't adapted to the system. The system was struggling to explain the rider. And that tension was only beginning. Ducati's braking philosophy meets resistance. Ducati's braking philosophy is one of control. Aero stabilizes the bike under deceleration. Electronics smooth the load transfer. Brake maps are designed to remove uncertainty from the rider's hands. The system works because it reduces variability. But Toprak introduced something Ducati's models weren't built for. Joys. His brake application wasn't binary, it wasn't pre-programmed, it was alive. Instead of hitting peak pressure immediately, he allowed a brief moment for the front tire to settle. Just enough time for grip to build naturally before demanding everything from it. On paper, this delay was dangerous. In practice, it was devastatingly effective. Insiders whispered about internal recalibrations. Engineers quietly adjusted simulations to account for what they were seeing. But the models never fully matched reality. Because the missing variable wasn't mechanical. It was human. And once that became clear, the conversation changed completely. The details no telemetry could capture. High-speed footage revealed what data alone couldn't. At the exact moment braking began, Toprak's body moved just slightly. A controlled forward transfer, arms relaxed instead of braced, the bike was allowed to breathe. Mid-corner entry, there was another adjustment, a near-invisible modulation of pressure, not driven by numbers, driven by sensation. These micro-movements existed in the blind spot of modern analysis. Too subtle to chart cleanly, too personal to replicate. Telemetry showed stability but not the reason for it. Engineers admitted privately that this wasn't something you could simply teach. It wasn't a setting. It wasn't a technique you could explain in a briefing. It was a relationship between rider and machine built over thousands of risky moments. And that realization brought fear. Because when instinct replaces system support, there is no safety net. Living where mistakes have no buffer. Toprak's braking lived dangerously close to the edge. Front tire load peaked near levels Ducati considered unacceptable. Any unexpected grip drop, any slight misjudgment, and the outcome would be immediate. Team members began to worry quietly. Not because it wasn't working, but because it was working too well. Riding like this requires absolute commitment. There is no room for doubt, no backup plan. Every lap demands the same level of trust in feel. The psychological strain was immense. Trusting yourself over data means accepting responsibility for every outcome. There's no system to blame, no margin to hide behind. Some questioned whether this could last across a full season. Others wondered if the cost would eventually surface in a moment no one could control. Because brilliance and danger often walk side by side. And just as those concerns deepened, the paddock erupted. The grid reacts. Rival riders noticed. Some began questioning their own breaking points. Others wondered what they had been leaving on the table. Social media exploded with slow-motion breakdowns. Fans debated whether this was genius or madness. Analysts argued over whether MotoGP had become too dependent on data. Inside the paddock, whispers grew louder. Not about development, about philosophy. Some suggested Ducati had been outridden, not out-engineered. Others believed this exposed a flaw in modern racing's obsession with predictability. For a brief moment, instinct reclaimed relevance. And that made teams uncomfortable. Because instinct cannot be standardized. And if one rider could do this, what would happen if others tried to follow? The answer depended entirely on Ducati's next move. Preserve the system or rewrite it. Inside Ducati, a choice emerged. Adapt the philosophy, allow more rider freedom, accept variability in pursuit of performance. Or protect the system that had already delivered dominance. Copying the technique wasn't simple. Without Toprak's feel, the risk outweighed the reward. A braking style like this couldn't be mass-produced. Speculation suggested Ducati chose restraint. Not because they doubted its effectiveness, but because they feared its unpredictability. Stability had built their success, and abandoning it for an exception felt reckless. Yet that decision carried its own consequences. Because ignoring a truth doesn't make it disappear. It only delays the reckonings. What this moment really revealed. This wasn't just about braking. It was about the limits of certainty. Modern MotoGP is built on data, simulation, and control. But moments like this remind everyone that racing is still a human sport. Data explains what happened. Instinct decides what's possible. As technology continues to evolve, the balance between rider and system will keep shifting. But this moment carved a warning into the season. Some limits exist only because everyone agrees to believe in them. And every so often, someone arrives who refuses to. Toprak didn't break the rules. He simply rode past where everyone else stopped asking questions. And in doing so, he reminded the paddock of something it had almost forgotten. No matter how advanced the science becomes, the rider still decides where the edge